In the summer of 1518, hundreds of people in one city danced until their hearts gave out. Doctors watched them die in the street, and to this day, historians still don't fully agree on why it happened. It started with just one woman. A week later, 34 people were dancing beside her. A month later, it was hundreds. This is the story of the dancing plague of 1518, and it might be one of the strangest true events in human history. It began in Strasbourg, a city in what is now France, in July of 1518. The streets were narrow and packed with timber-framed houses, the kind of medieval city where everyone knew their neighbors and where a single strange event could not stay hidden for long. A woman named Frau Trofea walked into the street and began to dance. Not joyfully. Witnesses described her movements as tortured, almost violent, as if her body were being forced to keep going against her own will. She danced through the day. She danced into the night. By the time she collapsed from exhaustion, she had been dancing for nearly a week straight. Her neighbors tried to stop her. They held her arms. They begged her to rest. Nothing worked. Within days, physicians were called in to examine her, and none of them could explain what they were looking at. She wasn't performing a ritual. She showed no signs of joy. Witnesses at the time described her face as blank, almost distant, as though she herself were a spectator to what her own body was doing. That alone would be strange enough. But then something stranger happened. Other people started joining her. Within a month, city records suggest around 400 people were caught in the same compulsion, dancing uncontrollably through the streets of Strasbourg. Not performing, not celebrating. Some of them were sobbing while they moved. Some collapsed from heart attacks, strokes, and pure physical exhaustion. At the height of the outbreak, city clerks recorded as many as 15 deaths a day among the dancers. Think about that. An entire city watching its own people die, one by one, from an illness with no wound, no fever, and no obvious cause at all. So what would you do if you were in charge of a city where hundreds of people suddenly could not stop dancing? The city officials of Strasbourg made a decision that sounds almost unbelievable today. They decided the cure for uncontrollable dancing was more dancing. They believed the affliction had to run its course, so they cleared out guild halls and built a wooden stage in the marketplace. They hired musicians. They even brought in professional dancers, hoping the mania would simply burn itself out if it were allowed to continue. It did not work. If anything, historians believe the music in the public spectacle may have made things worse, drawing in more people and reinforcing the compulsion rather than curing it. Eventually, authorities changed their approach entirely. They banned music and public dancing throughout the city and took the afflicted to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a saint that, according to local belief, could either curse people with compulsive dancing or cure them of it. The ritual itself was strange in its own right. Historical records describe the afflicted being given small wooden crosses and red shoes to wear, then led in a procession around a carved wooden statue of the saint while priests sprinkled them with holy water. It was equal parts medical treatment and religious exorcism, because in 1518 there was barely a line between the two. After days at the shrine, the mania is recorded as having finally faded. So what actually caused hundreds of people to dance until they collapsed? For a long time, one popular theory pointed to ergot, a toxic mold that grows on damp rye and can cause hallucinations and convulsions. It's a dramatic explanation, but historian John Waller, who has extensively researched the event, argues it doesn't fit the evidence. Ergot poisoning tends to cause violent convulsions and cuts off blood flow to the limbs. It doesn't produce coordinated, sustained dancing that continues for days at a time. Other historians have pointed to a folk tradition known as tarantism, a belief in parts of Italy that the bite of a tarantula could only be cured by dancing frantically until the poison was supposedly danced out of the body. It's a tempting comparison since tarantism also involved compulsive, ritualized dancing tied to a specific regional belief. But there's no evidence of any spider bites or any physical toxin at all behind what happened in Strasbourg. The dancers weren't reacting to a bite, they were reacting to something no one could see. Waller's research instead points to something called mass psychogenic illness, sometimes known as mass hysteria, a genuine involuntary physical reaction that can spread through a group of people under extreme collective stress without any physical toxin at all. And 1518 was a year of extreme stress in Strasbourg. Waller's research highlights a brutal combination of famine, disease, and crushing poverty in the region at the time. Crop failures had driven grain prices sharply upward the year before. Smallpox and syphilis were spreading through the population. People were dying of starvation in the same streets where the dancers would later collapse. On top of that, local belief held that Saint Vitus could curse the sinful with involuntary dancing. In a population already living in fear and desperation, that belief may have given their collective anxiety a very specific physical shape. Waller has described it less as a disease of the body, and more as a kind of psychological pressure valve, one that a starving, terrified population unconsciously built for itself out of the only religious framework available to explain suffering they couldn't otherwise control. Doesn't that reframe the whole event? Not a mystery illness from nowhere, but possibly the human mind and body responding to unbearable pressure in the only way that particular culture had a name for. Historians still debate the exact numbers. Some estimates drawn from surviving city records suggest the death toll may have reached into the dozens over the weeks of the outbreak, though the precise figure is difficult to confirm from documents that are now 5 centuries old, damaged, and incomplete. What isn't disputed is that Strasbourg's own physicians, writing at the time, treated it as a real physical affliction requiring real medical response, not a rumor or an exaggeration passed down later. This wasn't legend inflated by time. It was recorded in the moment by the very officials trying to stop it. Here's what makes this even stranger. Strasbourg wasn't an insulated case. 19th century physician Justus Hecker, who compiled some of the earliest documented histories of these events, found records of similar dancing manias breaking out across Europe for centuries before 1518, in Germany and the Netherlands and parts of what is now France. Different towns, different decades, the same eerie pattern. People dancing uncontrollably through the streets, sometimes for days, occasionally until they died from exhaustion. Hecker traced outbreaks stretching back as far as the 13th century, long before 1518, all clustered around times of famine, plague, and social upheaval. Different languages, different centuries, different religious frameworks, and yet over and over the same involuntary compulsion to dance, the same inability of those afflicted to explain or control it, and the same eventual fading once the surrounding crisis eased, which raises an unsettling question. If it happened over and over in different cities, centuries apart, could something like it still happen today? It's not just a medieval phenomenon either. In 1962, in a village in Tanganyika, now part of Tanzania, a boarding school of teenage girls experienced a sudden, uncontrollable outbreak of laughter. Laughter so intense and prolonged that the school was forced to shut down. The laughter spread to neighboring villages over the following months, eventually affecting over 1,000 people. No virus was ever found. Researchers who studied it concluded it was once again mass psychogenic illness, triggered in a population under the specific social stress of a region undergoing rapid political change following independence. Different century, different continent, different symptom entirely, but the same underlying pattern is Strasbourg, a group of people under collective strain and a body finding an involuntary, contagious way to express it. The truth is, something like it already has continued into the present day. Mass psychogenic illness hasn't disappeared, it has just changed shape. Researchers have documented outbreaks of shared, unexplained physical symptoms spreading through schools, workplaces, and now online communities, especially among groups already under extreme stress or anxiety. In some of these modern cases, groups of students have developed sudden, involuntary tic-like movements with no identifiable medical cause, symptoms that spread through social contact rather than any virus or toxin, in populations already under heavy psychological strain. One widely studied case took place in a high school in upstate New York in 2012, where more than a dozen students, mostly teenage girls, began experiencing sudden verbal outbursts and involuntary muscle spasms within weeks of each other. Extensive medical testing found no shared toxin, no infection, and no environmental cause. Researchers who studied the case pointed to conversion disorder, a modern clinical term closely related to what Waller describes in Strasbourg, in which severe psychological stress produces genuine, involuntary physical symptoms with no organic root at all. The context changes, the setting changes, but the pattern researchers describe is strikingly familiar. Real physical symptoms with no organic cause, spreading through a group bound together by shared stress. The dancing may be gone, but the underlying mechanism, a mind under enough pressure convincing the body to do something it cannot consciously control, apparently hasn't gone anywhere at all. So picture that woman again, stepping into the street in July of 1518, her body moving without her permission, in a city drowning in fear and hunger, in front of doctors and neighbors who had no explanation for what they were witnessing. We like to imagine the people of the 16th century as superstitious, and ourselves as rational, protected by centuries of science from anything so strange happening again. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The same species that danced itself to death in Strasbourg in 1518 is the same species freeing in classrooms and offices today, still capable of turning invisible psychological pressure into something the body cannot control and the mind cannot explain. 500 years later, we still don't have a perfect explanation either, just a growing suspicion that the human mind, pushed far enough, can make the body do things that look impossible, and that somewhere in that gap between fear and the body, this story hasn't fully ended at all. Maybe the real question was never what happened in Strasbourg in the summer of 1518. Maybe the real question is what your own mind might be capable of, if it was ever pushed that far.